Morning. Hello to everyone. Good to see everyone today. We are in the midst of a series on the book of Exodus. This is the fourth installment of that. And we'll be looking at today at a larger chunk of the text, starting in Exodus 6 and going through what are called the plagues, and stopping just short of where Dave Schallert took us today at the Passover, and we'll end just short of that one today. In the fall of 1991, when I was a boy, lived in in Washington State, near Spokane in Washington State. Awesome place to grow up. Just ride your bikes around all day, play with your friends, come home at supper, that kind of thing. So it was really awesome. And I played sports. I played baseball in the summer. One of the things that I did was take piano lessons instead, not instead of, but also in addition to playing baseball. And my teacher's name was Mrs. Manzo, and she was not easy. She was strict. Sometimes she would have booked too many people on her schedule, and you would get her husband instead. And he was like really easy and nice. You always hope for that one because he wouldn't, be so hard on you, and he could, if you didn't practice enough or whatever. But Mrs. Manzo, every fall, she would have this thing called piano camp, and we would go out to this campground facility with cabins, and there was a gymnasium, kind of sort of normal log cabins with bunk beds and stuff like that. And it was some weekend in the fall every year. And so I went this one year when I was 11 years old in the fall of 1991. And when we were in our cabin with the boys, I don't know, I was 11 years old, and most of the people were about my age. Some people were a little older. There was this one kid, and I think his name was Ben. And in the cabin, he had brought a snack basically for himself, but we all forced him to share with us. And he gave us all one chip of this new chip thing that was just released. No one's ever heard of it before, but it was this thing called Sun Chips. And he's like, hey, check out this thing that's called Sun Chips. They're awesome. And we all tried one, and we're like, oh yeah, Sun Chips. Those are awesome. I'm glad someone invented that. That's cool. So that was a big weekend, right? Sun Chips. You get to learn about that. But even more importantly, Ben also brought a boombox to piano camp. And he also brought, most importantly, a new album that had just been released by this band called Nirvana. And this album was called Nevermind. And I don't think the tape even worked by the time we were done with piano camp. It was a cassette tape, by the way, sorry. But I remember listening to it in the cabin, just blasting it full power. And we were like, it changed our lives immediately that day. From the first 4 chords that you hear with Smells Like Teen Spirit, which is a song that we played continually on a loop. Sometimes we'd hear the whole album, but we had a whole weekend of this. We must have listened to it 20 times, the whole album. But we would go to the gym and shoot hoops, just shoot around in the gym, and he would be blasting that. We would only play Smells Like Teen Spirit, the first song on this album, and once it was done, he would rewind the tape, play it again. And we just would listen to that for hours playing basketball, and it was awesome. And that album had just been released. That was a big deal to people like us who lived in Washington State, but it eventually became a big deal to the whole world, as you know, in just a couple months before, by the time it became 1992, that was the #1 selling album in the whole world. And the name of Nirvana, even though they had a previous album, this was the big one that caused their name to be known in all the world. And it changed a generation, shaped a generation, my own, and had an impact on many other people as well. So there are moments like that where through acts of creativity, you can cause your name to be known. There are also people who are on the more infamous end of the scale. People like Hitler and Stalin, classically, Mao, Idi Amin, Pol Pot, Vlad the Impaler, Ivan the Terrible, those kind of people who also have caused their name to be known in the world, but for other reasons, right? For the wrong reasons. And as we come into the text, as we enter into the text today, we see that God is encountering a person, Pharaoh, whose name is known throughout all the world for all the wrong reasons. He's a person who is antithetical to God's will, God's idea, God's picture, God's vision for what creation in this world ought to be. And in fact, he's even taken God's own people to whom he's given these promises and enslaved them and killed them and that sort of thing. But in Exodus 9, we read of the reason that God has decided to visit Pharaoh in a very powerful and hopefully persuasive way. In chapter 9, verse 13, Yahweh, we talked about that last week, said to Moses, "Rise up early in the morning, stand before Pharaoh, and say to him, 'Thus says Yahweh, the God of the Hebrews, let my people go, that they may serve me. For this time I will send all my plagues on you and your servants and your people, that you may know that there is no one like me and in all the earth. For if by now I had put forth my hand and struck you and your people with pestilence, you would have then been cut off from the earth. But indeed, for this reason I have allowed you to remain, in order to show you my power and in order to make my name known throughout all the earth.'" Here's what God is doing as he visits these signs, and that's in the middle of this plagues narrative. But here's what God is doing. He's, yes, demonstrating his power to Pharaoh. You think you're awesome. You think you're a deity. You think you're a divine Pharaoh. Well, I'm going to demonstrate my power to you. And also, the goal of God, one of the goals of God is missional here. It is to make his name known, not just to Pharaoh, not just to the Egyptians, but to all the earth. So that's part of the goal of the book of Exodus is for God to introduce himself first to Moses, as we saw last week, and revealing his name, and now to Pharaoh and the Egyptians and the ends of the earth. And so he's sort of introducing himself here, hence the title of the sermon, "Hello, my name is." He's letting people know who he is. And so we enter into this plagues narrative. But we begin just before that in Exodus chapter 6. Exodus chapter 6 is really important because this is what many people call the gospel of Exodus. This is the good news, the announcement of the good news of the book of Exodus. This too is God's motive for redeeming and rescuing his people. Here's what he says in Exodus chapter 6, verses 1 and following. The Lord said to Moses, the Lord is Yahweh, as you remember, "Now you shall see what I will do with Pharaoh, for under compulsion he will let them go. Under compulsion he will drive them out of the land." God spoke further to Moses and said to him, "I am Yahweh. I appeared to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob as El Shaddai, but by my name, Yahweh, I did not make myself known to them. I also established my covenant with them in order to give them the land of Canaan, the land in which they sojourned. Furthermore, I have heard the groaning of the sons of Israel, because the Egyptians are holding them in bondage, and I have remembered my covenant. Say therefore to the sons of Israel, I am Yahweh. I will bring you out from under the burdens of the Egyptians. I will deliver you from the bondage. I will redeem you with an outstretched arm and with great judgments, and I will take you for my people. I will be your God. You shall know that I am the Lord your God, who brought you out from under the burdens of the Egyptians." And he goes on to say, "And then I'll give you the land that I promised to Abraham," and so forth. But this text right here, especially verse 6 into verse 7, is the gospel of Exodus. This is the good news. This is the proclamation of good news to Moses and to the people of God. In fact, the 4 cups of the Passover that Dave Schauer was alluding to today, that we saw in the Passover celebration, Last Supper of Jesus, and on over the centuries, there's classically 4 cups of wine. And part of the reason there are 4 cups of wine is based on this text in Exodus chapter 6, that each cup represents one of the key phrases or verbs here in verse 6. I will bring you out from under the burdens of the Egyptians. I will bring you out is one of the symbols of one of the cups of wine. I will deliver you, the cup of deliverance from their bondage. I will redeem you, the cup of redemption, famously celebrated in the Lord's Supper. And verse 7, I will take you for my people. God covenanting with his people, saying, we belong to one another now. I will take you to be mine, and I will be yours. That is the gospel according to Exodus. And so we see God's motive here. The gospel announcement and the making his name known in all the world. And on the basis of that, we launch into the 10 plagues. I'm not going to preach a million hours on each of the plagues and what they mean and what they symbolize. Some people talk about, and we did even, in fact, in our kids' class, talk about, sometimes comparisons are made between each of the plagues and various gods in the Egyptian pantheon, and how maybe each of these plagues is addressing one of these gods and that sort of thing, which is really cool. But an even broader, zoomed out picture of the plagues is what I'm looking for today. And we're just going to do a brief overview, just mentioning some of them by name. In Exodus chapter 6, we begin with the last verse of the chapter, Moses saying before Yahweh, behold, I'm unskilled in speech. How is Pharaoh going to listen to me? And then Yahweh says to Moses, listen, I'm going to make you like God, and I'm going to make Aaron like a prophet. So you're going to speak to Aaron, and then he's going to speak the word forth to the people and to Pharaoh and that sort of thing. Okay? And here's what you're going to do. And this is what they end up doing. The first thing they do is they take Aaron's rod and they cast it down before Pharaoh and his courts, and it becomes a serpent. That's there in chapter 7, verses 8 and following. And we talked last week about how the serpent is this great symbol of Egypt itself and Pharaoh himself, and he wears that on his own headdress and that sort of thing. The thing is that Aaron and Moses do this thing, and it becomes a serpent. Well, they have these magicians in the court of Pharaoh, and they, the text says, use their secret arts, and they take their own staffs and throw them down, and they do the same thing. Serpents all around. Okay, 1 for 1. But then Aaron's serpent staff swallows up the serpents of the Egyptian magicians. Again, making a point about who really is God. And then, famously, comes this great sign. That's what they're called in the text, a sign, or wonders. They're not really called plagues in the text. But this sign where Aaron and Moses meet up with Pharaoh early in the morning as he's going out to the water, like you do every day, to the Nile River. The place, the foundation of this civilization in Egypt is the Nile River. That's basically their source of life. But the Nile River, although it's a source of life to the Egyptians, it's a symbol of death, as we know, to the Hebrew slaves. That's where Pharaoh had commanded the newborn babies to be thrown when they were just born. And in a great symbol demonstration of that reality, God says, okay, you want this to be a place of death? Well, then it's going to be a place of blood and a place of death to Pharaoh as well, to you. And so Moses and Aaron, they take Aaron's staff and put it in the Nile River, and it turns to blood. But the magicians are also able to reproduce this. And in chapter 8 and following that chapter, another plague, frogs. Frogs everywhere, all over the place. That's one of the things you see from a literary perspective in this text, is that all over the place in the plagues, there's this language about all and about every. There's a big emphasis on that. All the land of Egypt, all the cattle die, all the people suffered of boils and that sort of thing. And so frogs are everywhere, in all the places, in all the houses. But the magicians are able to reproduce that as well. And then later on in chapter 8, there is this, is it lice or is it gnats? We don't know. It's hard to figure out what the word means there. But whether it's lice or gnats, those become this great infestation of insects. God's making his name known, just like that great song of Nirvana, Smells Like Teen Spirit, which, by the way, also mentions insects. I think mosquito, if you know the lyrics. And how can we forget that great final line in that song where Kurt Cobain blows out his voice screaming the phrase, "Bloody Nile." And it doesn't even matter to me that you don't laugh at that, because I know it's a great joke. That you can look up the lyrics later and see why that's funny. I planned for no laughter on that, by the way. I said it to myself before I came here. But man, that's a great joke. Someday you got to look up the lyrics. So God is making his name known through these. The lice, all the Egyptian cattle die. The boils, the hail that destroys all the crops in all of Egypt. The locust that infests all of Egypt. And finally, we come to this penultimate plague, darkness, in chapter 10. Darkness for 3 days over the land. What is God doing here? Are these just picked arbitrarily? Picked for no reason at all? They don't mean anything? Or are they intentionally the exact consequences of who Pharaoh is and what he has done? Many commentators suggest that that's precisely what's going on here, that the plagues are in fact a reversal of creation and or a distortion of creation. Either a reversal of creation, slowly turning back the clock, rewinding the scene of creation back to its original state, or maybe something like hyper creation or hyper natural, a distortion, a chaos of creation with a billion trillion frogs or a billion trillion gnats or lice or that sort of thing. Either hyper creation, an infestation, a chaotic form of creation, hyper creation, or a reversal of creation, death itself, beginning with the waters and culminating in a reversion to pre-creation. Before God even said, "Let there be light," what was there? There was darkness. So God has rewound this whole thing, saying if Pharaoh stands for anti-creation, if Pharaoh stands for anti-life, then he will reap the consequences and the consequences of that, and God's children will reap the benefits of this. And so he reverses the order of creation all the way back until there's darkness that covers the land, and there's nothing, and there's no life, and there's not even any light in Egypt. God's making a point here. Pharaoh is anti-life, anti-creation. He's all about chaos, all about death, and so he reaps the consequences of that. Let me drive that point home by reading just a couple paragraphs from Terence Fretheim in his commentary on Exodus in the Interpretation series. He says, in order to accomplish God's mission in the world, that world must be teeming with life. That's who God is. That's what he's about. He's about life. He's about creation. If Pharaoh persists in his anti-life policies at precisely that point at which God has begun to reactualize the promise of creation, remember, the Hebrew slaves, despite the oppression, were beginning to multiply. Remember? That's in fulfillment of God's great vision of creation and his commission at the beginning, to be fruitful and multiply. They were doing this, and God had begun to re-actualize that vision. Pharaoh persists in his anti-life policies. If that's the case, then God's very purposes in creation are being subverted, and God's mission is threatened. God's work in and through Moses, climaxing in Israel's crossing of the sea on dry land, constitutes God's efforts to return creation to a point where God's mission can once again be taken up. In those instances where God removes the plague, and appropriate language, the appropriate language there is that of recreation. God overcomes the chaos, and he returns those elements of the natural order to a closer semblance of their created scope and intensity. These become anticipatory of God's recreational activity and are also played out in the gifts of water and food in the wilderness. And finally, last section here, God gives Pharaoh up to reap the natural consequences of his anti-creation behaviors, one of them being the hardening of Pharaoh's heart. God, seeing to this order, is not a passive just letting it happen, but God does function within certain limits provided by that order. The plagues are not an arbitrarily chosen response to Pharaoh's sins, as if the vehicle could just as well have been a foreign army or an internal revolution. The consequences are intentionally cosmic, because the sins are creational. God thereby acts to reestablish the rightness of the created order. This is ironically confessed by Pharaoh himself in chapter 9. And so the divine power over all forms of pharaonic power is demonstrated through the moral order for the purpose of recreating justice and righteousness in the world order. I want to read that last part just because I know sometimes we check out when people read stuff, but that last sentence is important. I want to read it again. The divine power over all forms of pharaonic power is demonstrated through the moral order for the purpose of recreating justice and righteousness in the world order. The cycle of human history is such that pharaonic powers rise up over and over again. We just listed a bunch of infamous people at the beginning of the sermon. Those sorts of people, those pharaoh types, come up over and over again throughout history. Sometimes they're individuals and great leaders. Sometimes they're institutions or corporations or ideologies, or whatever it is. There are oppressive things that come up over and over and over again throughout world history. And the task of God's people and the goal of God's work in this world is always the same, as Fred Time says, to overcome that pharaonic power through moral order for the purpose of recreating justice and righteousness in the world order. This is precisely the vision of Christianity. This is what Paul is talking about when he describes the ethics of Christianity. There's a lot of cool theology about Christianity, but the ethics of Christianity are related to that theology of new creation. That's exactly the text that we read earlier today in 2 Corinthians 5, where Paul says that, behold, if anyone is in Christ, this is chapter 5, behold, there's a new creation. Let's read that text real quick here in 2 Corinthians 5, and we'll finish on this thought today. 2 Corinthians chapter 5, verse 17. Therefore, if anyone is in Christ, behold, new creation. The old things have passed away. Behold, new things have come. Now and listen for some of the Exodus echoes with Moses and Aaron and Pharaoh and Egypt and all that in here. Now these, verse 18, now all these are from God, who reconciled us to himself through Christ and gave us the ministry of reconciliation, namely that God is in Christ reconciling the world to himself, not counting their trespasses against them. He has committed to us the word of reconciliation. Therefore we are ambassadors for Christ, as though God were making an appeal through us. We beg, this is what we ask people, on behalf of Christ, be reconciled to God. Isn't that what Moses and Aaron were calling Pharaoh to do over and over again? And then he keeps hardening his heart. That's the call, that's the plea of God and his people. Be reconciled to God. In verse 21, he made him who knew no sin to be sin on our behalf, so that we might become the righteousness of God in him. That's the very thing that Terrence Frettime was pointing out. We become the righteousness of God through living out this new reality, which is new creation. When we are in Christ, Paul says we are new creation. Whatever is going on in the world, whatever anti-life forces are out there, whatever anti-creational, whatever anti-God and his will and his vision, we are called to be that source of new creation, that demonstration of new creation in the world. Not just to counteract that, but to swallow up that death, that anti-life, the darkness in the light of Christ. To be that kind of people. That's what we're called to be. New creation in this world, to be the righteousness of God here in this world. That's what we're called to be. How do we do that? That's the question. I want to invite you to reflect on that this week. How do I do that when I'm at work? How do I represent new creation, not anti-creation? Order, not chaos. Life, not death. How do I do that at my job? How do I do that in my family? How do I do that in the streets of Holland during tulip time? Where do I do that? May God give us eyes to see, ears to hear what he is calling us to do, to be that source of new creation in his world. Let's stand and sing.